tired yet. Oh, Lord, I ain't tired yet. Oh, Lord, I ain't tired yet. Good morning. Good morning. You can take still, but you can't videotape. We've got our videotape guy here. So, ladies, I'm Sharon Cooper Murray, and I'd like to welcome you to the Community Rag Quilting Preservation Initiative. Before I start to tell you about the initiative, I'd like to tell you a little about me and how I became involved in rag quilting. When I was a very small child growing up in the PD, and for those of you that are not familiar with South Carolina, I grew up in Florence County in a small town called Lake City. My great-grandmother at Christmas would always take this piece out. It was a rag piece. Now at the time I didn't know what it was called, I was very young, but it was frayed and really fluffy and beautiful. And none of us kids were ever allowed to actually touch it unless no one was looking. Once I moved to Charleston, I'd ask people, do you know anything about rag quilting? It's gotta be. They used rags and the thing was really fluffy. Well, most people would tell me they had seen something like that as a child. Some said they had seen it as hook rugs and various other kinds of rug making. But no one knew how to do it. So it would slip in my mind and slip out. And finally, one day in the mid-90s, I walked into the community center on Guatemala Island. And there were 7 women sitting around a table, and they were making that rag quilt. Well, I couldn't believe it. So I asked them immediately, would you teach me? Well, most of them kind of looked at me and said to the effect, you know you're not going to do this, girl. Yeah, I'll do it, I'll do it. Well, from that day on, when they allowed me in their midst, for the next 3 years after that, off and on, I'd go and sit with the women on Guatemala Island, and I'd rag quilt. The initiative started when I went back. Most people know me as a storyteller. I've been telling stories for probably more than 20 years. So very few knew really very much about this fiber art thing that I was doing. So as the storytelling took off, I would travel quite a bit. So I lost touch with the women and really didn't go back and sit for many years. And then one day, I just felt the need to go back and visit them. And when I did that, to my amazement, more than half of them were deceased. And the ones that taught me, their hands were too infirm for them to actually tie the knots that were required to rag quilt. So literally, I was the only person actively rag quilting. And I thought something has to be done about this really quick. So my idea was, let's create an initiative. And the idea behind the initiative was that I'd introduce rag quilting to a variety of people. Of course, I do introduce it to Gullah communities that aren't familiar with it or have actually lost it in their communities, but I wanted to introduce it to everyone because to save an art form that, in my opinion, that is in as much jeopardy as this folk art tradition, it requires that all of us learn it and talk about it and be aware of it. So the Community Rag Quilting Preservation Initiative is designed to do a few things. It's first designed to make people aware of this folk art tradition because many people certainly are not aware of it. In addition, we're hopeful that we're able to recruit some new rag quilters. Now the ultimate goal for this initiative is to start to get to people to do this actively. Not only in the Gullah communities, but in communities all over South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida. That's what's called the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor, which is the coastal regions of those 4 states. And our ultimate goal is to try and create what's called a cottage industry. A cottage industry is kind of like what they did during the Depression. They would do what's called piecework. Now, some of you might be familiar with that word. Piecework. So if you needed to make a dress, somebody would cut out at one station, at one person's house. And then the next thing you know, they would carry the pieces, and then someone makes the collars and someone makes the various parts. And in the end, you have a complete dress. Well, the idea behind the cottage industry is very similar to that. One other little thing I want to tell you about me and my introduction to Gullah. And I think it's important that those of you that are not familiar with the Gullah culture learn a little about the Gullah culture. When it was realized rice would grow in Carolina, it was a need for a large labor force, because at the time there were only 2 known groups that had been growing rice for centuries. They were the Africans and the Asians. There was a problem getting to China, but Africans were already being sold into slavery in places like Brazil, the Caribbean, Barbados. So it was known where one could find an ample supply of people that already had the skill for this new crop that was growing in Carolina. When West Africans came to the New World, they spoke up to 109 different languages and dialects. So they were in slavery and could hardly understand one another. Now that brings me to the language. You see, as I said, I grew up in Florence County, and in Florence County, we don't speak Gullah. So when I got here, I'd never heard Gullah. Though Florence is only about 75, 80 miles away, I'd never heard Gullah. When I got out of college, my aunt and her husband had lived in New York for about 35 years and decided to retire and come to his home, which was Wadmalaw Island. Well, she called me and told me, Sharon, we're moving to an island. Well, when she said that, you know, when I thought of an island, I thought of like a St. Croix or something like that. So she said, would you like to come and visit for a week? I thought, yes. So first few days, I didn't even go out of the house, because from what it looked to me, there was not that many people that lived there, and all I could see was there was farm work going on quite a bit here. So I stayed in the house, and finally I decided I'm going to venture out. I can't stay in the house for an entire week. Well, instead of retiring, my uncle bought the small general store that was available, and next door to it, he built a small liquor store. So I walked out and walked into the general store. Well, finally I said, you know, I really don't have very much to do here for the rest of the week, so I'll work the liquor store so you don't have to walk back and forth. So he said, okay. So the next morning I got up bright and early and went into the liquor store to familiarize myself with what was on the shelves. Well, I sat and sat and sat until late afternoon, and my first customer came in. And when he came in, I hopped up, because of course I was going to be a proprietor. Well, he walked to the counter and he said, "Kuya na oyo pipara." So I tried to think of something right to say, but the only thing that came out was, "Huh?" He said, "You can get oyo pipara." You know, sometimes when you hear a foreign language, you think if you kind of squeeze your knuckles and squint your eyes when they talk, you'll kind of figure out what they mean. Well, I think he got a little really tired of me, so he said, "Get that foggy bowl over there." So I said, "Excuse me," and I walked over to the general store and got my uncle and waited on the man. Well, you know, I didn't think to ask him, what did he say? But I did notice that the type of liquor he gave this man was the largest amount of liquor in the entire store. So I thought, if someone else comes in here that sounds like that, I'm going to ease one of those bottles toward him. And I did. And I was wrong. So after 4 or 5 times of getting my uncle, he finally said, "Sharon, you know what? I know you said you want to help while you're here. Well, you know what? If you'll just go in that house and get that vacuum, And that you'll really be helping us. Now I think that was his kind way of saying to me, Sharon, you're actually causing more work since you've been here than before you came. But that was my introduction to Gullah. Though the island turned out to be not what I had anticipated it would be, I found something that I think was far more valuable. I was introduced to this new culture and realized that they spoke a language that I could not understand, but they were in America. So I became fascinated by that. And over years, I learned to speak the language. That kind of lets you know how deep I decided I was going to go into Gullah. I learned the language, which eventually led me to the first story I told you, to the Wadmalaw Island Community Center, where I met Gullah women that were in their 70s and 80s that were still rag quilting. Well, ladies, that's enough of me talking. We came here to work today. But now before we work, I want you to take a look at a few of the exhibits. I know some of you had an opportunity to go ahead and look at the exhibits, but a few of the things that we do with rag quilting. First, maybe I should go back a little. First, I'd like to tell you about the rag piece that's on the floor. Those women that I met rag quilting, well, I convinced them that they should make a rag quilt for me before I knew how to do it. And they said, well, of course. Now, it was originally a queen-size quilt. It took 7 women 3 months to make that quilt. And the top on the quilt has from 230 to 250 yards of fabric. When they put the batting and the back on it, it weighed about 40 pounds. That's why you only see a portion of it today, because it was entirely too heavy for me to try and carry around. So I cut it not quite in half, and then I took the batting out and took the back off of it so I could actually show people how that top was created. The other pieces, this big piece on the table is actually the community rag quilt that we carry to every host site. And ladies, today before you leave, I would certainly like for you to put at least 1 or more pieces onto this quilt. What we're going to do is we're going to travel. Now this is only 1/2 of the quilt. We've had 940 people to put 1 or more pieces on this, and you still see a lot of burlap. So you know we still have a long ways to go, and we haven't even started on the second half yet. And what we do is when the quilt, both sides are finally completed, then it's going to travel all of those host sites that originally had it. Now the names of the people, whenever they put a piece, at least 1 piece on, we ask for their name and the city and state. What will travel along with the quilt will be a folding placard. Now this placard will have the name of every single soul that put a piece onto the quilt. Thus far, we've had people from 15 states and 3 countries to actually put 1 or more pieces on it. Rag quilting is very simple in that you're using only little small strips of fabric and you're using a nail. There is no stitching on the top of any of these pieces that you see. Now the pieces that I do, even the backs that are put on, I hand stitch the back. But there's no stitching, we use a nail. But before we can start using that nail, ladies, we're going to have to cut our fabric out. The strips are generally about 5.5 to 6 inches long, and they're about the width of a forefinger. Now for those of you that have a tape measure, you could always see how wide that actually is, but they always tell me, use your forefinger, Sharon. You can't go wrong. So you're going to go 5 or 6 inches, and I have some pieces that have already been done if you'd like to use them as a template. And let me ask, does everyone have a pair of scissors with them? Okay, the strips are generally about 5.5 to 6 inches long, and they're about the width of a forefinger. Now for those of you that have a tape measure, you could always see how wide that actually is, but they always tell me, use your forefinger, Sharon. You can't go wrong.